Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. This is a very warm welcome to our these discussion series, these web series that we are doing. As you know, we have the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which is ongoing, and this is a wonderful opportunity to have member states, Indigenous representatives, Indigenous delegates, as well as representatives of the UN agencies here with us. It's the largest global gathering at the UN on Indigenous issues, so it's, as I've been telling our Indigenous delegates, you have to thank the Permanent Forum members because at one time, for 2 weeks, they bring you all together at one place, all the people you need to talk to. So here you are, and from there we have handpicked 2 of our participants, and I'd like to just, first of all, thank them very much for spending time, taking time to be here with us today. And the discussion today is going to focus on Indigenous peoples and the Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who are not very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, this is like the global agenda of the UN, which was decided by member states through a consultation process where they also listen to the voices, concerns, and priorities of Indigenous peoples, other stakeholders, UN agencies, and this is now the global agenda for the next 14 years actually, because as we speak, I'm getting older, as they say. So it is with the Indigenous peoples and Sustainable Development Goals. First, we'll have a speaker, is going to be Mr. François Weldon, who is the Director General at Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs with the Government of Canada. As you know, Canada has taken some tremendous strides in the last couple of years, from saying no to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to actually reversing their own position and being very frank and courageous enough to say, look, things have changed and now we are very much supportive of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You have the advantage of having a very charismatic and visionary leader at the moment in Canada. So I would like to just ask you to say a few words and then we can start off.
Thank you very much, Chandra. It's a pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate the opportunity. I'll just take a few minutes to set the stage, I think, for what's going on in Canada. I think one of this may sound somewhat obvious, but I think it's important to set the stage for how we are approaching this and how we can consider the work that we're doing with respect to the SDGs and the engagement that we'll be having with Indigenous people throughout that process. As I said, there's essentially 2 components of a meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples in terms of the implementation of the social development goals. A commitment to the SDG goals themselves and a process by which to implement them and achieve the objectives of the agenda. And the other is a commitment to and a process by which we have meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada who are affected by all of those goals, as we all are. So, I mean, Canada's made it, patently clear that it's committed to the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. That has been made very, very clear. In fact, in Canada, there are 8 ministers in the federal cabinet, including the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, my minister, and the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, also my minister, oddly enough. We're still working that out. That have been tasked as champions to advance the SDG goals from the government perspective. But it's also very, very clear, and it's recognized by the government, that this is a whole-of-government effort, and it requires a whole-of-government effort to actually be able to achieve these ambitious and important goals. Now, as was highlighted in a speech by the Prime Minister here in September last year at the General Assembly, many of the priorities of the Government of Canada, as established in its own mandate, are very well aligned with the SDG goals. And in that speech, he named only a few, but he's made it very clear that there is a commitment to implementation of the SDG goals, both domestically and abroad. And in parallel to this, Canada has made it very clear that it wishes to renew its relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada and build a new relationship based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. So this particular initiative takes many forms in Canada. I'll name but a few, but very important components of that agenda. First is a change in departmental structures. within Canada, a dismantling of the old colonial system, and ostensibly taken form by the abolition of what was Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, which is a department that in various forms has existed since the 1870s. It is the department that has always been responsible for the management of the Indian Act. We want to move away from the Indian Act, move beyond the Indian Act, and renew that relationship. The new departments that will replace it are the Department of Crown-Indigenous Relations, which is really mandated with the redevelopment and the reestablishment of that relationship. And another department, which is the Department of Indigenous Services, which is focused on improving the quality of the services provided to better meet the needs of Indigenous peoples. So the establishment of a collaborative mechanism to jointly identify priorities and develop policies and programs that better meet the needs of Indigenous peoples in Canada across numerous departments and across a wide range of policy areas that are reflected in the SDGs. And this is taking place through the establishment of a permanent bilateral mechanism. In fact, multiple permanent bilateral mechanisms, one with First Nations, one with Inuit, and one with Métis, which is a forum within which there is an opportunity to identify the priorities of those groups and the shared priorities with the Government of Canada, and work together to develop the policies and programs that are needed to support those individuals. And so there's also, above and beyond that, there's been a creation of a working group of ministers that are tasked with the review of laws, policies, and practices in Canada to ensure that they are consistent with Canada's international obligations and the rights of Indigenous people. If you take all of these together with the commitment to the SDGs, the mechanisms are in place to actually have the collaborative mechanisms to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard within the context of the ambitious agenda of meeting the SDG goals. I think I'll leave it at that for the time being. And thank you.
Thank you very much for giving us this overview of what's happening in Canada. Last year, actually, the Permanent Forum members met in Canada for the pre-sessional meeting, and it was hosted by the Government of Canada, for which we were very, very happy to have that on, very graciously hosted, I should say. And we also met with a number of the Indigenous peoples, the Métis, the First Nations, as well as some of the ministers and parliamentarians. And it was really inspiring to see the efforts that are being made to put in place the institutional framework, because that is also very important, to make sure that you have the framework in place as a basis for the outreach, the service delivery, and very especially for the impact that it's going to have on Indigenous peoples. Speaking of that, we will move on to our next speaker. It's a great privilege and honor to be here with Ms. Joanne Carling. As many of you know, Joanne Carling has been a tireless advocate of Indigenous peoples for many, many years, not just in Asia, where she is from, or in the Philippines, the country that she belongs to, but also worldwide and globally. She was also a member of the UN Permanent Forum for 3 years, and we had the privilege of working with her then. A tireless and determined and committed advocate of Indigenous people's rights worldwide. Joanne, you have the floor, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Chandra, and thank you for that inspiring developments happening in Canada. Now, I would like to first start with why are Indigenous peoples engaging in the 2030 Development Agenda. There are 3 reasons for this. One is to promote and ensure the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples as affirmed by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this includes, of course, the protection of the land, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples, the proper implementation of free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to self-determination, as well as respect for cultural integrity of Indigenous peoples. This is very critical because the goals present some risks for Indigenous peoples in the exercise of their collective rights. We have targets that relates to economic growth. We have targets that relates to energy, production and consumption, and other goals, which are all relevant for Indigenous peoples, but there are risks in terms of violation of their rights, particularly to land, territories, and resources, when projects related to energy, related to economic growth, related to production, and even related to biodiversity conservation is concerned. The second one is indigenous peoples are actually have a lifestyle that is fully consistent with sustainable development. And we want to have this mainstreamed and acknowledged and supported within the SDGs. It's not coincidental that 80% of biodiversity, the remaining biodiversity of the world, is in indigenous territories, and this manifests, this demonstrates the sustainable way of indigenous peoples' use of their resources, while ensuring the respect for their cultural diversity. The third point is indigenous peoples also want to have their self-determined development supported in a holistic way. Because in relation to our sustainable lifestyle, we also want to determine our development in a way that is respectful of our culture, but also provides for our basic needs. But even if you talk, for example, of having health or education for indigenous peoples, this has to be done in a proper way, because to cite, for example, education, the goal on education is quality education, and that is not just about learning how to count or to read, but ensuring that our languages are also used, so that because that also facilitates the transfer of knowledge. And that's one important aspect for us. Our traditional knowledge should be part of what we call education, but also in the way we manage our resources and we pursue our self-determined development. So those are the three reasons why we're engaging. And there's already a lot of lessons learned from the MDGs where we were invisible. We were never mentioned in the MDGs, but now we see a dramatic improvement in the SDGs because there's a clear reference to indigenous peoples. We are one of the major group, and it also calls for data disaggregation by ethnicity. And on top of that, there's also a pledge of leaving no one behind, and that the SDG should be done in an inclusive and participatory manner, and it is underpinned by the realization of human rights. We believe this provides a good opportunity for indigenous peoples to partner. This is the time for us to also, within this kind of framework, to establish genuine and equal partnership with states, with even the private sector, or UN agencies and other development actors, if they commit to respect our rights and commit also to support our self-determined development.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And just to acknowledge that Joanne, when she was a member of the Permanent Forum, was taking the lead on the SDG process and was very influential in actually going to talk to some of the member states to persuade them to listen better to the voices of indigenous people. So thank you for that. As Joanne mentions, the SDGs has some progress. There are, in fact, 6 specific references to indigenous peoples in the SDGs and in the Development Agenda of 2030. And this is very much within the framework of leaving no one behind. We have had, I'm with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, where we also have the Division for Sustainable Development, Statistics. So these are all efforts that are ongoing, but still there is a long way to go if we are really to fully realize the 2030 development agenda. To just say that the 2030 development agenda was actually developed because with the MDGs, we didn't really get where we were supposed to go. And that's why we now have the second step process of the SDGs and the 2030 Development Agenda. I want to just remind you that, we have the forum in session, and the special theme of the forum this year is lands, territories, and resources. And we're listening to a lot of interventions from both Indigenous peoples and member states exactly on the themes that Joanne was talking about. And this in terms of biodiversity. We've been looking also, and I was listening yesterday to a gentleman who was from Brazil, from one of the isolated, living in voluntary isolation, as we say. And he said that he had come out to present their situation to the world. Otherwise, they do remain where they are because they want to remain uncontacted. That is their decision, their right to self-determination, as Joanne was pointing to. And I know that in many countries you have different modalities of how this is done. And we listened to one of the representatives from Canada, from Nunavut. And there you have this huge tract where there is self-government and self-autonomy of the Indigenous peoples. But what about the other areas where this does not take place? And I'd like to first start off with you, like in Canada. And I would like to ask if you can look at it in two ways. One is through the lens of what is happening in Canada, but two is what Canada can do to help Indigenous peoples around the world, because this was also something that was brought up at the Permanent Forum discussions. So.
Thank you. Well, you raised a very interesting example in Canada with the self-government and the self-governing regions in the Arctic and the 4 land claim agreements that are there. As I mentioned earlier on in my introductory remarks, one of the objectives of some of the transformation that's taking place in Canada currently is in fact to support that self-determination, whatever that self-determination might mean. And as you say, people will view self-determination in very different ways. And there are a variety of different relationships that exist between the Crown and Indigenous nations within Canada, many of whom are still, structured ostensibly by the Indian Act. But there has been an incremental effort over the years to begin to provide opportunity for people to use alternative means of governance and alternative legislation that is in place to govern the relationship, whether it be around lands, whether it be around resource sharing, whether it be around a variety of other things. It has become a very significant agenda of the government to move beyond the Indian Act where possible, and in whatever fashion, and at what point in time First Nations or others are able to do so. I can give a few examples if you like. There was one of the first sort of self-government agreements, if you will, that dates back to about 1973 with the Cree in northern Quebec. Since that time, I think we are now at 28 self-governing nations within the country. But under this government, we have actually increased our efforts to move more communities and more nations into self-government. And I believe there are currently 75 ongoing negotiations. And so this is something where there is a very concerted effort to establish the relationship where far more, in fact, of the governance is actually within the hands of the First Nations themselves. This is it requires quite a bit of effort and time, to be honest, because many, as you were mentioning earlier on, and I heard this just last night in a conversation that we were having about the SDGs. No one should be left behind. It was pointed out to us that in many instances, and Canada was no exception to this, people were put behind. And so this is a time at which we're trying to reverse that. But the reality is that by virtue of the history that many of these communities have had and these nations have had over the 150 years of Canada's existence and even prior, many of those communities are now left in a situation where self-government is something that will be very difficult for them to assume. But it is the efforts of the government to try and bring those communities to a level where indeed they can take on self-government in a way that is appropriate for them and how they would envisage that self-determination. There are other initiatives as well. You cited the self-governing territories in the north, but we're also in very similar conversations with the Métis as well in the western part of the country. There are agreements between the Government of Canada and all of the 5 governing members of the Métis Nation in the West that have set a framework in place to begin those negotiations towards self-government. It's a very different concept, mind you, with the Métis than it is for First Nations or Inuit, because they are not necessarily land-based. They are much more dispersed within general Canadian society. But that said, they are a people, and they have their own aspirations and their own way in which they want to serve their populations. And so it is a very different job for Canada to undertake a self-government negotiation with these groups, because it is a very different construct than anything we've done in the past. But we have set the wheels in motion to make that happen. And as I said, as part of that, I mentioned earlier on these bilateral mechanisms that are in place. These bilateral mechanisms are in place for the very purpose of trying to identify the priorities for these nations, co-develop the policies and programs that respond to their needs and their priorities, and build up the institutions and the programs that reflect their particular needs, be they First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, that they then might be rolled into a self-government agreement when they are prepared to assume those responsibilities. So that gives you a sense of where we are heading. The pace at which we are heading is far faster than it once has been. There are hurdles, but there are hurdles that we will have to assume and tackle jointly with the Indigenous nations that we're dealing with.
And externally? Because,
I
just wanted to remind you of
yes,
that, because
of course.
it was brought up as well in terms of companies that are working outside as well.
Just recently, actually, there was, and this is something that is always very difficult to sort of apply sort of an extraterritorial application of your laws. There are very few countries that do it systematically, and Canada is not one of those countries that has done that, but we've taken a very different approach. And it was only in February of this year that there was an extraction industries ombudsman that was created for the purposes of educating, informing Canadian companies operating abroad about their obligations, and also serving as a dispute resolution agent, if you will, in terms of any activities that the Canadian companies might be undertaking abroad where there are challenges to or objections to the activities that they are wanting to engage in. And so wanting to ensure that they are respectful of domestic laws in the countries that they are operating in, that they are cognizant of their obligation to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples in other countries, and offer up opportunities and support in terms of reaching resolution.
Which comes very neatly into the next question I'm going to put to Joanne, because I know that Joanne has been working with the Indigenous Navigator project. And maybe if you'll say a few words to explain it, because that's exactly where it's heading.
Yeah, the Indigenous Navigator is actually a tool to monitor and generate data by Indigenous peoples themselves on the situation of or the status of the respect of their rights, particularly their rights under the UN Declaration, the rights of Indigenous peoples. So this is a way to provide what you call an evidence-based data to make governments and other development actors to account if they are violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. So this is done at the community level, where they themselves are the ones evaluating if they are able to exercise their rights, and also at the national level if there are laws and policies that are recognizing rights, and how are these being implemented. So that's what the Navigator looks at. And within this, we have also integrated the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals. So part of the tools, because our framework in looking at the SDG is in relation to how are our rights being respected, promoted, and realized. So in that sense, when we're talking of, say, ending poverty, what is critical for us in ending poverty? One is, of course, the recognition of our land rights. We cannot end poverty of Indigenous peoples. We cannot reduce hunger if our land rights are not respected and realized on the ground. So with the Navigator then, we will know if people are still, they feel that they are poor because their lands were taken away. So that's how it also links to the SDGs. Now, I just want to relate now to the discussion of the forum on lands, territories, and resources. As you have mentioned, there's a massive list of speakers and all wanting to talk about the violation of their land rights. This clearly demonstrates that things are still moving in the old way, business as usual, all these development models that are not based on human rights, that are not respectful of cultural diversity, that are not respectful of also the contributions of Indigenous peoples to development. We are seen more as that we are obstructing or that we are anti-development when we defend our lands and resources, and that has to change. If we're talking of sustainable development, that attitude has to change, and there should be a political will to finally recognize the Indigenous people's rights and partner with Indigenous peoples in good faith. Because I believe that in the spirit of good faith, with respect to our rights, particularly to our lands, territories, and resources, we can work together to achieve sustainable development, not only for Indigenous peoples, but the whole of the country. And everybody will benefit from how Indigenous peoples are managing our resources. So I think we need to have that kind of shift in the way we approach Indigenous peoples in the context of sustainable development.
I think this is what Joanne raises is very important in terms of the fact that at this year's forum we have seen an enormous amount of interest in the theme from both Indigenous peoples but also from the member states to share what is happening, that this is efforts that are being undertaken, and you have the other side, the other perception that not enough is being done and that Indigenous peoples are very much going to be left behind. As was mentioned also in the opening statements, that Indigenous peoples are at the front lines of biodiversity, of climate change, and in that process of being in the front lines, they also come under attack in many instances. And we have received, the UN, we always receive lots of, many alarming reports of Indigenous rights defenders who are being targeted for their activism. And I hope I don't need to mention that Joanne being one of them herself. But what I wanted to come back to was the fact that when you look at biodiversity and you look at the SDGs, and thank you, Joanne, for mentioning the Human Rights Navigator, Indigenous Navigator, which links up the UN Declaration and the SDGs in a very, very easy to read, easy to use framework. And I was just going to ask our colleague, because you are now also going through this process of your policies, where I think there is some talk of also seeing whether there should be a new act or new legislation. So how does that all fit in?
There is indeed legislation on environmental protection, which is being reviewed and is advancing through, but without getting too far ahead of what the final legislation might look like, and obviously something that is still subject to some debate. It is the changes in the environmental legislation have been very, very clear in their intention to dramatically change the way Indigenous peoples are included, and at what stages of the process they are included as well. It is something where the legislation would require a very early engagement, consideration of the interests and how best to move forward, really setting the stage for a much more collaborative exercise, one way in partnership with Indigenous peoples. But you also mentioned the issue of being on the front lines, and in Canada that of course is no different, and it's certainly true, be it in the north or in coastal areas where people actually do feel the effects of climate change very directly. And there have been some significant investments that have been made there in terms of adaptation, in terms of protection of certain water habitats, in terms of the redevelopment of areas, in partnership with Indigenous communities in those areas, because and also using and entering into partnership with Indigenous peoples to be, as you say, in the advantageous position they have. It may sound funny to call it an advantageous position, but they are in some ways those who can observe the changes early and can alert and allow government to work with them to address the issues earlier on in the process. I think we also must make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that the SDGs are a very broad and interconnected set of objectives. It is not purely environmental, but actually have a variety of other very significant indicators and targets that are sought to be achieved, and that is something where the Government of Canada has actually made some very significant investments to support the SDGs explicitly in supporting its statistical agency to collect much better data to do this. And that data, which is of course still in the process of development, is something that we will need to do to ensure that we have the richness of data to understand the impacts of various developments, be they environmental or otherwise, on the broad range of Canadian population, including Indigenous peoples. And it's sometimes very difficult from a statistical agency's perspective to be able to get that data at the granular level that you need to really understand who's being affected by what and what policies and programs need to be brought in place to address the specific needs of those populations. So that is something else that the Government of Canada is investing in to ensure that they have the ability to do that. And as I didn't mention earlier on, as part of this process, and we understand that this is a work in progress. One will not, there were changes with the Millennium Development Goals. I think the Sustainable Development Goals hit developed countries differently. It affects them very directly. And so I think the degree of engagement from developed countries on the SDGs is very different than it would have been under the former set of goals. And this is something where we have really put the machine in motion to address, and it will take some time. There is absolutely no doubt about it. We have institutional frameworks which are inconsistent with the achievement of these goals, but we need to be certain that we can actually track our progress toward it and keep the dialogue open as to where we are making progress, where we are failing to make the progress that we would seek to achieve. What are we doing that is working, and can we measure that, and can we learn from those successes and, in fact, continue to move toward the full achievement of those objectives?
Thank you, because one of the issues that has been brought up, two issues that you're bringing up that I'd like to pick up on and maybe ask Joanne to respond to. One is, as you said, that the impact on developed and developing countries is quite different. Yet the reason why the SDGs in this latest round of development goals, it's universally applied. And when we look at Indigenous peoples, whether they are in Canada or in Norway or Finland, Sweden or the US or in Philippines, Nepal or Kenya, they are among those who are most likely to be left behind. And one of the priorities that the Indigenous peoples are saying that we don't want to be only in those 6 that where there are references to Indigenous peoples. All 17 goals are relevant to Indigenous peoples and have some impact either directly or indirectly. But I wanted to ask Joanne to respond a little bit to the question on data. And I know that Statistics Canada does a really good job, and that's why we actually are very happy you're here as one of our good practices, that we can ask other countries to follow. And yet you are saying that you still also face difficulties and challenges in that. And I was just going to ask Joanne how she sees, maybe she can offer some suggestions on this to you.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the core demands that we had, is the issue of generation of data and disaggregation of data, on ethnicity and generation of data, particularly addressing indigenous peoples. Because unless that is done, we will not know we cannot specifically track the progress or gaps if there is no data disaggregation. And in terms of generation of data, we're willing to fully cooperate with National Statistics Office, UN agencies in providing those data, because we know our situation better than anyone, and we can then provide that data. But I want to exemplify one case in terms of data, for example. One of the goals is what we call SDG 7, for everyone to have access to clean and modern energy for all, right? And it says that majority of the people in the rural areas do not have access to electricity. And if you look at further in that data, if you look at who are those in the rural areas, it's indigenous peoples. So it's the majority of indigenous peoples. But at the same time, a lot of energy projects are being implemented. You have dams, you have now with the solar or other renewable energy, they're being developed and in indigenous territories without their consent, and yet they don't get access to electricity. So in this context, we're saying that even with this call of modern and clean energy for all, it has actually a potential negative impacts, as we are already experiencing. There's dams, for example, is part of what is called clean energy, but this has already displaced millions of indigenous peoples and is still part of the solution to climate change and to achieve sustainable development in the new plan. And yet there is no seriousness or political will of states and their the private sector, their partners, to ensure that they respect the rights of communities. And this will definitely cause us being left behind, right? Because it's not, and they're generating power, energy, not for us, but it's to support industries. But we also see opportunities where if it's in the spirit of recognizing our rights and in the spirit of partnership, renewable energy that is appropriate to our situation can actually work. It can also address other SDG targets, like, for example, ending poverty, providing food security. It has multiple benefits if it's done the right way. So the Indigenous Peoples Major Group has taken the initiative of what we call Right Energy Partnership, where the goals is to ensure that our rights are respected and protected in energy development, and at the same time provide access to indigenous peoples of energy that is appropriate for their condition and part of their self-determined development. So this, I think, is a very innovative, we are offering a very innovative form of partnership in the implementation of the SDGs. And the distinction of this partnership is, one, it's human rights based, that's number one. Two is it's indigenous led. It's led by indigenous peoples. This time it's led by the rights holders. And it supports our self-determined development. And this partnership is open to all that can contribute in achieving Goal 7, but also ensuring the protection of rights. So this is the kind of and with this, we will generate data to show are we being adversely affected, and how far are we in providing access to energy for indigenous peoples. And we want to partner also with other groups who are also doing data generation or monitoring and reporting on the issue of energy.
Thank you, Joanne. And actually from my own personal experience. I come from a community in what is in Bangladesh, and this was during earlier times when they built a dam. So we were displaced then, so I know full well. Yet we did not have electricity. I grew up with hurricane lanterns and all that kind of thing. But it's good to know that now there is this in place that can offer some kind of guidance, some kind of relevance, but also legitimacy in terms of how next to address this issue, because you do want to have clean energy. We do need clean energy, yet at the same time, how to do this in a way that it is not affecting Indigenous peoples. We're going to be closing, so I'm going to ask you to give me 2-3 words on what you see as next steps and how we can do better.
Well, the how we can do better part, I think we have started down the road, but as I say, very much a work in progress. But part of that exercise, and as you may well know, we will be part of the SDG Voluntary National Review, which is coming up in only a couple of months. It is early in the process, really, considering how long we have, how short a period we have actually been fully engaged in this. But I think we've chosen to be part of the Voluntary National Review for the purposes of forcing us to gather the views of Canadians and Indigenous Canadians to understand where the priorities are and what's working and where we need to be going next and how to approach that, so that we can bring that to the UN in July of this year and learn from that and then move on. So that is very concretely the next step for us.
Thank you. And Joanne, I hope you'll be here in July as well.
Yes, we will be here in July. And I think the next step really now is for states and other actors to take action in their pledge of leaving no one behind. It's not enough to always be saying those, but what we need are concrete actions in terms of policies, in terms of specific programs, in terms of mechanisms for inclusion and participation of Indigenous peoples. And of course, the central issue again for us is the respect and recognition of our rights, and also the acknowledgement and enhancement of our contributions to sustainable development. And we are reaching out to have partnerships with all other development players for us to achieve sustainable development with the pledge of leaving no one behind.
Thank you very much, both of you, Mr. François Weldon and Joanne Carling. And I hope that this is the start of a great partnership in action, which is with rights and dignity and recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine their own development priorities and be part of the development process. So thank you all for joining us today. And very big thanks to our both two speakers who have placed this issue very eloquently and very clearly on the agenda. Thank you all.